Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Economic Security for Women, Bringing It Home from CSW webinar. This is Judith Van Unen from GERA International, and I'm joined also with Carol Shaw from GERA International. We've done the Bringing It Home from CSW because we want to focus on the agreed conclusions that come out of CSW, the Commission on the Status of Women. We do this because too often each year goes by very quickly with these agreed conclusions and what comes from it, and it's important that we know how to use them and that we do use them to strengthen organisations' policy and advocacy as we go through the year and prepping for the following year. Now, the presentation is being recorded and you'll be able to listen to it later at any time on the eS4W website. Thank you for joining us. The aims of the webinar is to provide a virtual space for those either new to the UN CSW process and procedures of CSW, or who want to talk about it further, to learn and interact with those who have attended, and to discuss the CSW 63rd session agreed conclusions and why they are relevant and important to Australian domestic policy. We want to explore how the agreed conclusions can contribute to your organisation's work and the issues you have identified in your work with either eS4W last year or in your own organisation going forward. We want to understand how eS4W members' organisations can build and support advocacy work with the key issues identified by yourselves and by eS4W. We want to discuss Beijing Plus 25 and what is planned for CSW in the 64th session and beyond. So the introduction for this is the 63rd session of the Commission on the Status of Women, which took place at the United Nations headquarters in New York from the 11th to the 22nd of March 2019. How does CSW agreed conclusions link with women's rights and your work? What happened at CSW 63rd session? The agreed conclusion gains and challenges. What happens next? Beijing Plus 25 and CSW 64th session and Women's Global Forum in 2010. Why is this relevant? What are the links to domestic policy and services? The international agreements, not legally binding but soft law, opportunity to impact on policy, national policy through outcome documents, the opportunity to strengthen organisational positions by using CSW agreed conclusion. CSW provides a space for civil society to influence the government outcome documents. Advocacy in New York is to add language or to advance gender equality. There are so many civil society organisations and many women who come from around the world to gather. It provides opportunities to share information, programs and ideas. And this itself advances everybody's work and objectives. And I hand you now to Carol Shaw.
Okay, thank you, Judith. I'm going to leave it on this slide for a little while we talk about, I'm going to go into a little bit more discussion around the international agreement. And I just want to pick up on the fact that it is not legally binding and that we use it in a soft law way. So that means finding the hooks in the documents that we can use to further our gains. So when I talk a little bit later about some of the work that Economic Security for Women have done, I want you to remember that. It's like putting the putty into the brickwork and shoring it up a little bit to make it firmer so that eventually we can get some harder laws and policies and frameworks around these issues. Oh, and now I've got to find the mouse, and we go. So the Commission on the Status of Women, just a quick word on what the priority and the secondary themes were. The priority theme was social protection systems, which is really about access to public services, sustainable infrastructure for gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. This would be looking at the policy environment. If we put this into an Australian context, this means putting it into the policy environment, the legislative environment, and whether the services are working or not. The review theme, which is a second theme that is discussed every year and is always linked to a previous agreed conclusion, was women's empowerment and the link to sustainable development. So these are the agreed conclusions that came out of the 60th session. So they would have been reviewed in a round table and we would have been able to get something that comes out of that. Do you want to put this in? Judith, about social
Yes,
protection
certainly.
systems?
Social protection systems can make a critical contribution to the fulfilment of human rights, particularly for those who are trapped in poverty, marginalised or vulnerable. It also adds to the feminisation of poverty of women in older age as a consideration in Australia in particular.
Thank you. So when we talk about human rights and we talk about fulfilment of human rights and we talk about how this is linked to human rights in your work, this is just a very small table that you would have seen in the previous webinar that we did, which looks at some of the economic security for women identified priority areas, how they link with the Beijing Platform for Action, and B+5 is the 5-year review and agreed conclusions from Beijing +5, that review. CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which some of you will know as the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the 2030 Agenda is much bigger than the Sustainable Development Goals. It includes a lot more, but I've tried to simplify this a little bit so you can see how whatever happens, we're not just talking about one declaration. We're talking about a number of human rights that have been agreed, and they've been agreed by Australia as well as other countries. So let's have a look at what came out of it. The 63rd session happened. We all went to New York. We got absolutely exhausted. Some of us collapsed at the end of it. Some of us didn't. Some of us came home ready to fight. Now, what we did get, and I'm going to start with the gains that we got, because we did manage to get new international standards on women's human rights to social protection systems, access to public services and sustainable infrastructure, which is the technical, which is basically the framework within which it was. We managed to get some prior agreements that were maintained. This was specifically around sexual and reproductive health and rights, education, gender-based violence, and the recognition of the need for policies and legislation and procedures and services that address the diverse needs of families. Now, we know that families is a contested area in this space. We talked about that in the last webinar. We also got some good conclusions on the responsibility of the state to protect women human rights defenders. So that's the plus point. There were a few challenges. The agreed conclusions were not that strong, really, and I'll go through a little bit of the language that came out of that. While the Commission reaffirmed in its urging governments to actually address some of the issues, it's using language such as consider ratification of, consider ratifying or acceding to the matter, which is really not strong language at all, but we have got some enablers and some good stuff in there. So what they didn't cover was they really didn't retain some of the important language we've managed to get in the past on service provision. And this is specifically around sexual and reproductive health services for survivors of violence. So this is violence in its broader context, not only in the domestic and family sphere, but also in the broader context of conflict, natural disaster, trafficking falls under some of this. So we didn't manage to retain some of that language. We failed to, we failed to commit in integrating sexual orientation, gender identity and gender expression into the design of social protection, public services and infrastructure systems. Now, this is not an old argument. This is something that is an ongoing advocacy point and is being picked up, but very, very, very slowly, and it's linking into other, it tends to link into other UN agreements rather than to actual recognition here through the Commission on the Status of Women. the professionalization and expansion of strong conservative voices. This was something that I haven't witnessed, and Judith, I don't know the last time you saw this, but I haven't seen this since back in the Beijing Plus 10 days, which is 10 years ago,
at least, yes.
Where we're really getting the conservative voice organized. They're coming in busloads. They're bringing young women into the center. They're handing out leaflets. They have little carrier bags. There's a lot of funding and resources being given to the conservative groups to move into this space and to take
to put pressure on
some of the language and the governments that are in place. They were very visible in this context in the corridors. Some of the other challenges were these aggressive tactics. Now, I'm mentioning the Citizen Go bus. I refuse, and we all refused to post pictures of this. This was a bus that they paid the organization that funded it. I'll just check which organization that was. They funded, I think it was CFAM, I'm not quite sure. They paid $23,000 to actually get a bus that drove around the block past the UN every day, and on it there was a graphic picture of a fetus accompanied with the message, "Let me live." And this was basically circling past the UN about every 10 minutes. A lot of people sent it off by social media, and then it was decided, no, we're not going to do that. We're just going to ignore the fact that it's there and let them spend the money on what they want to spend it on. But the fact that this is happening also shows that there is a push. On and off the UN floor, there was a challenge on trying to discredit some of the language and some of the positioning, which has resulted in a weakening of human rights language, a lack of agreement, some states arguing to water down previously agreed matters. This is really saying that we're pushing back to some of the language that we managed to get through back in 1995. Now, how sad is that we're trying to have language on 1995 when we can't get to it. There was open harassment of sexual and reproductive health rights groups, LGBTQI, so that's the lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer and intersex side events. So the side events were held both within and outside of the UN building, and the tactic seemed to be that a lot of ultra-conservative groups would invade the space and then question from the very beginning of the presentation. So I actually didn't witness this. I'm taking this as a second-hand. Did you see any of that? No.
Not directly.
And there was a large anti-abortion cohort, as we know, that lobby is.
If I may just say briefly, neither eS4W or its members and or JERA does not hold any particular position on abortion or anti-abortion. It is about the fact that we do hold the position that it's a personal choice for women to make, and a very difficult one in regards to abortion. And I'm just noting for all of you that this is not a stance we are taking. We are simply informing you of what we observed and what was happening at CSW.
Okay, so let's get into the agreed conclusions. The agreed conclusions, this is what you can now download from the UN Women website, and at the end of this process, at the end of this, there is a slide with all of the links, and if you can't get to that slide, you can also always contact Sharon from Economic Security for Women, and she'll help you out with where to find these. So the way that the agreed conclusions come out is there is basically 3 sections to it. There is a preamble, and then there are action paragraphs, and then there are closing paragraphs. And so in the preamble, it's basically about reaffirming all of the commitments to all of the declarations and agreed conclusions, and how they link to CEDAW SDGs 2030 agenda and any other conferences, treaties and agreements. The preamble is pages 1 to 10, so the document itself is 22 pages. So 10 of these are just basically the UN and governments in the UN recognising the treaties, recognising as well that there is a pushback on women's rights, and this is stated throughout the document. There is a fairly strong paragraph in these conclusions in 2 sections, which are actually affirming the role of civil society in these decision making. The structural challenges and the barriers that are faced from the global economic frameworks, violence against women and girls, sexual harassment, shifting global priorities. You can see it here, the impact of trade agreements. They're recognizing that all of these things are the environment within which this particular CSW took place. And there are specific paragraphs within this preamble which talk about migrant workers, the rights of migrant workers, refugees and women in armed conflict. As regards to, there are some regional and to regional work. All right, the action paragraphs, and I think we'll maybe go into a little bit more depth on these, Judith, and how they link to economic security for women. But basically, the action paragraphs are, and you'll see it's bracket A to SSS. So what happens is, you start off with A, B, C, D, E, F, G. When you get to Z, you start with AA. So it's AA, BB, CC, DD, right? When you get to ZZ, you go into AAA, BBB, CCC. So as you can see, there are 3 lots of getting through these action paragraphs, and they are 11 pages, so slightly longer than the framework. So what these do is this part is broken into 5 sections. So the first section is strengthening the normative, legal and policy frameworks. This means, how do we enable the environment for strong policy and for action to take place? So these paragraphs, A to DD, are really looking at how that works. Paragraphs EE to MM are looking specifically at strengthening women and girls' access to social protection. So in those paragraphs, you will see, if I do EE to MM, you will see in there, and Judith, I think this is one that you were particularly interested in, they're looking at frameworks for the income security for older women. This is directly linked to eS4W.
It is, but I think it's an issue that most of the women's organisations and the women's sector have brought up for many years. And this is about the feminisation of poverty in older age. And while it relates to much to do with superannuation, I think it's very important that we put it in the context of the way the agreed conclusions are put forward in an international arena. But I think we need to use that sort of language to repeat, particularly given that we'll have another government come in, regardless of which party. I'm just saying that there will be another government coming in shortly. We need to use this language to look at what is happening and how do we strengthen and advocate and progress our advocacy with this new government to say, looking at the poverty of women in older age. It's a very big problem in Australia, not just globally, and I think we have an opportunity here to use this kind of language to go forward.
Okay, so we'll go a little bit into what some of those specific paragraphs are later. The other section is strengthening access to public services for women and girls. So that's really about being able to get access to the services, as it says, making the infrastructure work, and then mobilising resource strengthening women's participation and improving evidence. So when we talk about time use surveys, the time use surveys sections would be between JJJ and SSS. Some of them have strong language like take action to, we improve, you have to improve the design, to improve, whereas some of them are very weak and they have language such as to consider. The closing paragraphs really just recall and reaffirm their commitment to the Beijing Platform for Action, all of the reviews, and then calls for with this particular year because we're moving into a review year, and as we know, the Beijing Platform for Action is reviewed every 5 years. We're calling for UN agencies, governments, civil society to start to mobilize more around the Beijing 2030 agenda. All right, so let's have a look at how eS4W priorities are reflected in the conclusions. So you have to bear with me on this one. Judith, feel free to talk.
Well, I think given that it is a sizable document even for agreed conclusions on a regular basis, and there is quite a lot in this I think that we can take heart from, that so many things have been mentioned, and therefore it's agreed language by our government, even though it is non-binding and it's soft. I think there is a lot of language in there that we have agreed to as a Australian government that we can take and use and bring forward in advocacy.
Okay, so thanks Judith, the agreed conclusions, the agreed priorities of economic security for women that are directly spoken to and that we can use quite a lot of this document are care work, decent work, financial security, education, and then the other is really strengthening the national mechanisms. And I would put into the enabling of civil society voices within this space, given that a lot of time was taken throughout the proceedings in recognising, the Secretary-General recognised that there was a pushback on the pushback, which means there's a lot of pushback on civil society voices as well as the issues that we were trying to push, that were trying to be pushed to be yes. Progressive. So economic security for women, if we take very briefly L, in care work. Now, in preparation for the Commission on the Status of Women this year, Economic Security for Women undertook a submission to the government, and if we look at paragraph L of the outcome conclusions, it talks directly to the recommendations that are coming out of their recent discussion paper on the role of carers and the impact of economic security for women, which came out of the white paper prepared by Stephen Koukoulas, and is speaking to a lot of the work that is ongoing at the moment.
And it's interesting on para 23, if any of you have the agreed conclusions in front of you when you're watching this, on para 23 it says the Commission recognises that social protection systems, access to public services and sustainable infrastructure have not adequately addressed the needs of caregivers and care recipients. It further recognises that women and girls often undertake a disproportionate share of unpaid work and domestic work, including the care of children, older persons, persons with disability and persons living with HIV and AIDS, who continue to be undervalued and under-recognised. So this sort of language is important for us as advocates to be using in talking about care work and the changes that are desperately required to bring about adequate equality.
Okay, so do you want to say anything on the decent work agenda? Or? So what we found, what Judith and I did earlier this week was we went through and we tried to identify where some of the members' work was sitting. So for the Older Women's Network, there is a really strong recognition of the role and participation and effective and meaningful participation of older women. That is in X and JJ. For those of you listening from the Older Women's Network, BPW, Business and Professional Women, the gender pay gap's really hit.
And Older Women's Network.
And yeah, I've mentioned the Older Women's Network. So gender pay gap, very strong language in BB, CC and DD for you. So as you will see again at the end of the presentation, Prue Mooney will be speaking on Beijing Plus 25 review and an International Women's Conference due to be held in 2020. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Asia Pacific NGO Committee on the Status of Women, AP NGO CSW, for providing us with these slides and for giving us insight into the timeframes and the possibilities and opportunities that we have to participate in these events. So Beijing 25 basically is it's 25 years since the Beijing Platform for Action and since the landmark agreements happened in Huarou, Beijing. And so now we are reviewing this. This will be the 5th total review of the Beijing Platform for Action, which has 12 critical areas we'll talk about in a moment. This means that for this year, in preparation for the Commission on the Status of Women, there will be extra steps. At the national level, there are extra steps by the government. They are requested to fill out questionnaires and to prepare. They've already started this process, and I've just realized there's a spelling mistake on there, but we'll pass that one over quickly. And the NGOs, the civil society, have an opportunity to actually come together to coalesce and to caucus around their own issues and provide a separate report that can go in at the national level in the frame of comments, papers, position papers, or can be taken directly into the regional level. Now, this is the extra step because governments will be meeting in Bangkok at ESCAP, which is the Economic, Social, Cultural and Political Center or whatever. And there will also be a regional forum that attaches to that. So at the moment, UN Women in New York have nominated a number of NGOs and networks that are regional networks across Asia and the Pacific to come together to design what this looks like. And so we'll be hearing more about that as it comes through. There is going to be a special event which is totally different to anything that we've had in previous reviews, which will be taking place in the September session of the UN General Assembly in New York. The national consultations on the government reports, as well as the regional meetings, so these are any of the civil society reports that are prepared at the national level that feed into the regional and into the international, will be carried through to CSW 64, but also presented at the UN General Assembly. We already, which is unusual, have the dates for CSW 64th session. That will be the 9th to the 20th of March. So the day after International Women's Day is quite good. And through to the 20th of March, you can book that off now and get yourself some early cheap accommodation because we know how expensive it's going to be. 2020, so we're moving into next year. We're talking at the moment around about June, July. There's a few questions on this and how this is going to take place, but basically France and Mexico at the moment have agreed to fund a global women's conference to be held away from New York, now outside of the US anyway. The review will be looking mainly at the 12 critical areas, and I'll let Judith talk a little bit about past reviews and how this feeds through.
Certainly. You've got in front of you now the 12 critical areas for the BPFA. These are the ones we have reviewed every 5 years, and you can find those previous consultations that we have done that we called caravans when JERA has done this consultation as broadly as we could with as many women around Australia and the diversity of women around Australia, both rural, Indigenous and in cities. But this year is a bit different, and this time round, as Carol has explained, it is going to be a slightly different process. But we are hoping that still those many diverse voices will be captured in this process, because these are still areas of critical concern. Each of these are hopefully hyperlinked, but you can also find them on a number of websites should there be a breakdown in our link at any time.
Yeah, the last review, I think we had 3,500 voices included. Yeah. So you can gather a lot of momentum around this broad church of
absolutely,
content.
And it is important that we get that diversity of voice. So what is government and NGOs being asked to do at this particular stage? The support for NGO parallel reports on the Beijing Platform for Action and CEDAW deadline is May 1st, 2019.
That's for government.
And that's for the government to have put something forward. Yes. We need to develop strategies to strengthen ties between the UN and the critical social movements on equality, sustainable development and peace, and we need to create online opportunities for feminist and women's journalists, theatre, arts and cultural events. And we need to bring the global, local together. For an example, the Cities for CEDAW that is growing now out of the US and beyond. This is important, again, as I said, to make sure that we do get the voices of civil society going forward into government and forward to the UN. So how can NGOs take action? You need to mobilise around national NGO parallel reports to present to governments. It is essential, important, and critical that you and your organisations get together to have a voice around those 12 critical areas. Those are important to your organisations and to the issues you have been advocating for. Wherever possible, hold public events on the Beijing Platform for Action and CEDAW in schools and communities, and to create an intergenerational events wherever possible during 2019 and 2020. Oops, yes. These parallel reports are now called parallel as opposed to shadow reports as they once were, and we don't know why this has changed, why the language is important for the UN to have changed to be called parallel reports. So these were shadow reports, so we would look at what the government would say and then we would ask women how they compared what was being said by government to what they felt was action on the ground. So how can NGOs make sure governments learn about them? We need to make sure that we ensure that not just politicians, the government departments and your representatives know what women's voices are saying and what they feel about the issues that are coming up. And where are the NGO guidelines to do these reports? This is another important question for us to be asking.
Well, since we prepared this slide, there's been a little bit of an update. So the reasoning around the shadow reports, I'm going to be putting into the notes page underneath, which is basically the shadow reports are prepared around conventions and treaties with obligatory reporting, and the parallel reports is something that UN Women's come up with because they really want to recognize that these things have a status and have a session. So similar to side events and parallel events, we've got shadow reports and NGO parallel reports. And these, as we said, will be taken to CSW. The guidelines will be available on the NGO CSW website, which is the New York website, not the Asia Pacific, but will be paralleled and shown onto that. So that was the update that I received this week.
Thank you, Carol.
The other project that is happening through the NGO CSW, and any of your members, it was interesting in Tasmania last weekend to hear some of the work that's being done at the local level. There is going to be two big projects at the global level. One will be memories and messages for the next generation. So similar to eS4W's writing to my 16-year-old, they had that 16-year-old self?
Yes.
Yep. Really about memories and messages from Beijing. So that's for the oldies and those more weathered in the discussions. And to be written, Gerald will be working on one of these. Judith just decided. And the second...
Those are less young, I would rather
The less
say.
young, those more the dinosaurs. Book two, the other book, which is going to be hosted again, these are global books, not national or international, so anyone can put into them, is My Issues, Hopes and Dreams. And this is really more about poetry, stories, movies, short stories. Again, some of the work Jared did around the issues of relationships. We did little snippets of films. We'll be putting some of those forward. And these are really about bringing the arts into and social media into this framework. A global women's conference. Now, who would have thought way back when they said no more global women's conferences? So this is not going to be a UN conference, but this is going to be a global women's conference. And it's currently supported, these are the terms, I'm very careful about this language, currently supported by France and Mexico. So it may be held in France or it may be held in Mexico. There's been various discussions around this, and they are at this moment ongoing. So we will be forwarding and updating. The suggested time at this moment is June/July, when of course it's summertime in the global north, and probably the same temperature most of the way around in Mexico. I haven't been to Mexico. But as Fonzilla says, it is confusing at the moment, so let's see how all of this plays out. There will be a Global Women's Conference. It is being supported by France and Mexico, and we'll wait and see where that is to be held and how that's to be held. To learn more, here's the slides you can go to. These have been hyperlinked, so you should be able to go onto the eS4W page. We will be adding to this the links to the past reviews that are on the JERA International page. We have been, what's the word I'm looking for? Participatory in convening the last few reviews, and so the documentation will be on the JERA website, I will put the link into this space. All right, we would like to, over to you, Judith.
Okay, we would like to acknowledge eS4W and the Asia Pacific NGO CSW, and like to thank the following people and organisations for their time, experience and input into the webinar. Sharon Page, Carol Shaw and Judith Van Unen, that's us.
Sharon Page, of course, is from
Economic Security for Women, Asia Pacific NGO Committee on the Status of Women, AP NGO CSW, and Prue Mooney, Director of the International Engagement for the Prime Minister and Cabinet. I also would personally like to add my thanks to Carol Shaw. I've had a challenging personal health issues of late, and Carol has picked up and run with most of this, and for that I just really need to say thank you and acknowledge her contribution and her great effort, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Judith. We will try now to show you the Prue Mooney video again, and hopefully this will be fixed for the recording, but let's see if we can play it again, and please let me know if you have sound.
I'm Prudence Mooney, Director of the International Engagement Team in the Office for Women. I'm very happy to join you again for your web conference and provide an update on preparations for 2020. Throughout 2020, UN Women will build on galvanising moments in the 21st century women's rights movement. This includes the 5th anniversary of the Global Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, the 10th anniversary of UN Women's establishment as the global champion for the empowerment of women and girls, the 20th anniversary of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. My focus for this update is the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action of 1995, the most visionary agenda for the empowerment of women and girls everywhere. Developed at the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, China, known as the largest ever gathering of gender equality advocates, the Beijing Platform for Action was adopted by 189 governments committed to taking strategic, bold action in 12 critical areas of concern: poverty, education and training, health, violence, armed conflict, economy, power and decision-making, institutional mechanisms, human rights, media, environment and the girl child. In 2020, it will be 25 years since the Beijing Platform for Action set out how to remove the systemic barriers that hold women back from equal participation in all areas of life, whether in public or in private. UN Women stands at the centre of mobilising governments and civil societies to keep the promises of the Beijing Platform for Action to all of society. ESCAP, the UN Regional Commission for Asia and the Pacific, is leading the regional review for us in close collaboration with UN Women. The Asia Pacific High-Level Intergovernmental Meeting on Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment, the Beijing +25 review, will take place 25 to 28 November in Bangkok this year. Together with ESCAP, UN Women is working towards an inclusive regional Beijing review process that provides clarity on areas which this region's member states and other development stakeholders need to focus to accelerate the realisation of the commitments of the Beijing Platform for Action, as well as the 2030 agenda of the SDGs. UN Women is leading the engagement of civil society partners within the region. They are collaborating with leading civil society partners to facilitate the establishment of a Beijing Plus 25 Regional Civil Society Steering Committee, which will spearhead civil society engagement in the national and regional review processes, including the November meeting in the lead up to CSW 64 and the Global Gender Forum. UN Women will work with the Steering Committee on developing a roadmap and set of activities to be undertaken, and amongst UN Women's key priorities, they will be targeting a 2-day convening of regional and national civil society organisations immediately prior to the November meeting to provide a forum to which UN Women's partners can discuss issues arising from the national reviews and agree on key areas of concern and focus, as well as key messages for the ministerial segment of the November meeting. UN Women will also be seeking the inputs of civil society partners on the focus and content of the November outcome document, together with ESCAP and engaging with you on a regional communication strategy that targets collective advocacy and social mobilisation around the Beijing Plus 25 review process. My team and I look forward to working with you to prepare for Beijing Plus 25.